Claire, your uncle is losing his business as you're single. Putting your name on a mortgage won't kill you. That was my stepmother. Valerie. She stood in the kitchen I had just spent $30,000 remodelling, demanding my private credit to bail out the man who had actively defrauded my father. I stared at the espresso machine I'd flown 70 hours of medical helicopter shifts to afford, then at her teary, manipulative eyes. She wasn't asking. She was commanding. And right beside her, my father stared at the floor, defending a betrayal so deep it stopped my heart. If you have ever been treated like a bottomless ATM by your own family, drop a comment with the city you are listening from right now. In my line of work as a paediatric flight nurse, panic is a luxury you absolutely cannot afford. When a patient crashes at 3,000 feet, screaming does not restart a heart. You look at the vitals. You assess the bleeding. You make a clinical decision right now. I was looking at the two people in my kitchen and running a triage protocol in my head. Valerie shifted her weight. Her designer shoes clicked sharply against the hardwood floor I had paid to install. She was playing the role of the desperate, caring sister perfectly, but her eyes were calculating and cold. She had expected me to yell. She had expected a fight. To someone like Valerie, a fight means negotiation. A fight means she still has a chance to win. David finally looked up. He opened his mouth, probably to recite his usual script about how family always helps family. I held up a single finger. The gesture was so small, so quiet, that it stopped him mid-breath. My credit score is not a life raft for your brother's poor decisions, Valerie, I said. My voice was perfectly level. It was the exact tone I used to tell a pilot we were losing cabin pressure. But Lily, Valerie started, immediately pulling the ultimate trump card out of her sleeve. Lily, my 12-year-old half-sister. Leave Lily out of this, I replied softly. I picked up my duffel bag from the floor. It was heavy, packed with 48 hours of pure exhaustion and the lingering, metallic smell of aviation fuel. I looked directly into Valerie's eyes, refusing to blink, refusing to offer even an ounce of warmth. The answer is no. It will always be no. I walked past them. I could feel Valerie's resentment burning into my back like a physical heat. David remained entirely silent, choosing the path of least resistance, just as he always did. He would rather watch his eldest daughter be financially drained than endure a single evening of his wife's manufactured tantrums. The $30,000 I spent on this kitchen was not a gift. It had been a desperate attempt to fix a foundation that was already rotting. I had paid for the cabinets and the countertops because David complained about his back acting up in the old layout. I thought it was an investment in his comfort. Valerie had simply turned it into her personal stage. I climbed the stairs to the guest room. I didn't slam the door. Slamming a door shows loss of control. I closed it with a soft, definitive click, shutting out the noise of a house that no longer felt like mine. The lock clicked into place. I am 38 years old, and I hold the position of chief flight nurse. People outside the medical industry hear the title and immediately think of a comfortable, six-figure salary. They do not know what hazard pay actually entails. Hazard pay means flying into a blinding winter storm in the Pacific Northwest because a 10-year-old boy has a ruptured spleen and the mountain roads are iced over. It means calculating precise medication dosages while the cabin drops 200 feet in a sudden, violent downdraft. It means holding a terrified mother's hand while her entire world falls apart, then wiping the blood off your boots and doing it all over again 12 hours later. That is exactly how I built my net worth. Every single dollar in my savings account was earned at an altitude of 5,000 feet, operating on 3 hours of sleep and a stale cup of coffee. I didn't get lucky. I didn't inherit a massive fortune. I sacrificed my 20s and the better part of my 30s. I missed holidays, birthdays, and quiet Sunday mornings. Valerie saw my bank balance as a lottery winning. She saw it as a communal pool of family funds that she had an absolute right to dip into whenever her side of the family ran dry. She did not see the night I spent performing chest compressions on a toddler until my arms went completely numb. She did not see the therapy bills I paid out of pocket just to keep the nightmares at bay. When I first became a nurse, I was terribly naive. I thought if I just worked hard enough and shared enough, I could fix everything. I thought I could buy David's peace of mind. I paid off his truck loan. I covered the property taxes when he was mysteriously between jobs. But Valerie's arrival changed the dynamic entirely. My generosity was no longer appreciated, it was expected. And then, it was demanded. I sat on the edge of the guest room bed, staring at my hands. They were perfectly steady. They had to be. But inside, a cold, surgical realization was settling over my chest. The incident down in the kitchen was not a random, desperate request. It was the culmination of years of quiet, persistent boundary pushing. They thought I was weak because I was quiet. They mistook my professional composure for submission. They assumed my refusal downstairs was just a temporary hurdle they could eventually overcome with enough guilt. They were about to learn a very painful difference. I never bleed for free. 2 hours later, I needed a glass of water. The house was dead quiet. I walked downstairs, listening to the floorboards creak. Valerie had gone out, probably to complain about me to her friends. David was likely hiding out in the garage, tinkering with tools to avoid thinking about his life choices. I noticed the mail pile on the entryway console table. Valerie usually sorted it meticulously, throwing away the junk and stacking the bills in neat, passive-aggressive piles. Today, it was a complete mess. A thick stack of grocery flyers and old newspapers was shoved haphazardly against the wall. Something caught my eye. The edge of a thick, cream-coloured envelope was peeking out from beneath a local coupon booklet. It looked incredibly official. I pulled it out. It was addressed directly to me, Claire Hayes. I did not live here permanently. I only kept this address on file for a few old, dormant accounts, simply because my actual physical residence changed so frequently during my early career. The return address belonged to a major national bank. A bank I did not currently use for any of my primary finances. I slid my finger under the flap and tore it open. My eyes scanned the formal, typed text. Dear Ms. Hayes, we regret to inform you that your recent application for a commercial mortgage guarantee in the amount of $250,000 has been denied due to insufficient secondary income verification. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. $250,000. This was not a request I had simply denied in the kitchen. This was a massive financial application that had already been submitted. It had been processed. And it had been rejected. Valerie had not been asking for my permission down there. She had been trying to manipulate me into co-signing a document she had already attempted to forge. She had likely hit a brick wall when the bank required a live signature or a secondary verification step she could not digitally bypass. How did she have my social security number? How did she know my exact credit score, which the rejection letter explicitly cited? I looked at the date stamped at the top of the letter. 10 days ago. She had been actively working on this massive fraud while I was stationed in a remote mountain town, completely off the grid with no cell service. A normal person might have screamed. A normal person might have marched out to the garage and demanded answers. I didn't. My mind went perfectly, terrifyingly still. It was the exact kind of stillness that descends right before I begin a complex, high-stakes medical procedure. The threat to my livelihood was no longer just an abstract family argument. It was documented. She had breached my financial perimeter. The only question left was how deep she had managed to go. The real war had begun. I folded the heavy rejection letter and slid it deep into my pocket. I needed to think clearly, without the fog of family sentiment blurring my vision. If you are the capable one in your family, you already know the invisible chains I am talking about. Psychologists call it the rescuer's trap. When you are the only person who can consistently solve a problem, you quickly become the only person who is blamed when the problem isn't solved. For years, I was the designated adult in the room, even when I was 22, eating cheap ramen noodles to survive nursing school. David would call me to complain about the electric bill being past due. I would silently send him $50 I absolutely could not afford. I did it because I loved him. I did it because society conditions us to believe that is exactly what a good daughter is supposed to do. I did not realise I was normalising a toxic dynamic, sacrificing my own foundation one small compromise at a time. When Valerie married him, the demands didn't magically stop. They just grew much more sophisticated and expensive. It was no longer $50 for electricity. It was $5,000 to fix a leaking roof. It was $10,000 for David's sudden, uninsured medical deductible. And because I was professionally successful, because I never complained or asked for anything in return, they assumed it was perfectly easy for me. They assumed I had an endless, magical reservoir of wealth and absolutely no personal needs or dreams of my own. I had unknowingly trained them to treat me like a silent, unfeeling benefactor. The profound tragedy of being the strong one is that no one ever pauses to ask if you are heavy. They just keep adding more weight to your shoulders. They assume your spine is made of solid steel. I had built this trap myself, by never saying no, by never letting them see me sweat or panic. I had forfeited my right to be treated like a human being. I was just a walking utility. Standing in that silent hallway with the forged loan denial burning a hole in my pocket, I felt a sudden, profound sense of grief. It was not for the money. It was for the father I thought I had. The father who had watched his new wife attempt to steal $250,000 from his eldest daughter and actively chose to look at the floor. That grief lasted exactly 3 minutes. Then, the rigorous medical training kicked back in. You cannot save a critical patient if you are crying over their wounds. You have to sterilise the environment and stabilise the bleeding. I was done feeling sorry. The next morning, the entire house smelled like expensive roasted coffee and artificial vanilla. It was Valerie's absolute favourite scent. I was sitting at the kitchen island, drinking my tea black, when a small, timid shadow appeared in the doorway. It was Lily. She was 12 years old, blessed with David's quiet eyes and a nervous, fluttering energy that always broke my heart. Lily was the only genuinely innocent person left in this house. She was the sole reason I still bothered to show up for major holidays. She was the reason I had not simply changed my phone number and vanished from their lives entirely. She walked up to me slowly, clutching a slightly crumpled piece of drawing paper. "I drew your ambulance, Claire," she murmured, looking down at her mismatched socks. I smiled, a real, genuine smile, and gently took the paper from her hands. It was a sketch of a medical helicopter. "It's absolutely beautiful, Lily. You got the tail rotor exactly right." Before she could even respond, Valerie's voice sliced through the warm air like a scalpel. "Lily, go upstairs and finish your history homework immediately. Private school does not pay for itself." Lily flinched, gave me a quick, terribly apologetic look, and hurried out of the room without another word. Valerie walked into the kitchen, perfectly dressed and manicured, pouring herself a steaming cup of coffee. She didn't bother to look at me. "She really loves that school," Valerie said casually, stirring her drink. "It would be an absolute shame if we had to pull her out next semester. You know, with her uncle's business failing and all. Family finances are just so tight right now." It was a masterclass in psychological extortion. She wasn't just asking for my credit score anymore. She was holding a 12-year-old child's education hostage. She was banking entirely on my love for my little sister to override my strict financial boundaries. "Are you saying David cannot afford her tuition?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly mild and inquisitive. I am saying, Valerie replied, turning to face me with a cold, hard stare, that when a family is in crisis, we all step up and make sacrifices. Some of us just have much more to give. You do not have a husband. You do not have children to feed. What exactly are you saving all that hazard pay for? Claire. There it was. The ultimate quiet invalidation. Because my life did not look exactly like hers. My money wasn't really mine. It was just sitting in a waiting room, waiting for a real family to claim it. I took a slow sip of my tea. I thought about the rejection letter safely hidden in my room. I thought about the specific legal documents my mother had set up for me years ago. I am saving it for a rainy day. Valerie, I said quietly. The storm was already here. When you grow up as the designated problem solver in a chaotic household, you learn very early on that transparency is a dangerous thing. If people know you have a life raft, they will sink their own ships just to climb aboard yours. I realised this fundamental truth when I was 25 years old, shortly after I paid off my father's second overdue property tax bill. I knew that if I did not build an invisible wall around my finances, my family would eventually drown me. So, I began to construct my armour in absolute silence. I did not keep my money in the same local bank David and Valerie used. I drove 3 towns over and opened accounts with a national institution they had never heard me mention. I opted out of all paper statements, ensuring that not a single piece of financial mail ever arrived at my father's address. When I needed to keep physical copies of highly sensitive documents, I rented a secure, safe deposit box at a branch located an hour away from Portland. I still remember the day the bank manager handed me the small, cold metal key to that box. It felt heavier than it actually was. That key was my true sanctuary. It represented a boundary that Valerie's manipulative tears and David's passive guilt trips could never cross. Over the years, as I took on more grueling flight shifts and my hazard pay accumulated, I funneled the excess capital into diversified portfolios and high-yield savings accounts. I lived well below my means. I drove a reliable 5-year-old car and kept a modest apartment near the hospital base. Whenever I visited my father, I deliberately dressed in simple, worn-out sweaters and never spoke about my promotions or my bonus structures. I let them believe I was just scraping by, a dedicated but financially average nurse. It was the ultimate camouflage. If they thought I had nothing left to give, they would stop asking. Or so I foolishly hoped. But Valerie was predatory by nature. She did not need to see the vault to know there was treasure hidden somewhere. She could smell the quiet confidence that financial independence brings to a person. She hated my independence because it meant I did not need her. And more importantly, it meant she could not control me. She had spent years trying to chip away at my exterior, asking casual questions about my retirement contributions or my base salary, which I always deflected with vague, boring answers. I thought my firewall was impenetrable. I thought I had covered every single digital and physical footprint I possessed. I was about to learn that when a parasite cannot find a front door, it will patiently dig through the foundation. My armour was strong, but it was not entirely flawless. Long before I learned how to protect myself, someone else had already anticipated the exact war I was currently fighting. My biological mother, Sarah, died when I was in my early 20s. She was a pragmatic, sharply intelligent woman who viewed the world without a single ounce of sugarcoating. While David preferred to live in a comfortable state of denial, my mother always saw people exactly as they were. She loved my father, but she harboured no illusions about his terrible weakness when it came to conflict. During her final weeks in the oncology ward, the smell of clinical antiseptic became permanently burned into my memory. It is the same smell I encounter every single day on the helicopter, on one of her last lucid afternoons. She asked David to leave the room to get her some ice chips. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, she reached under her pillow and pulled out a small worn leather notebook. She pressed it into my hands with a grip that was shockingly firm for a woman losing her battle with cancer. David is a good man. Claire? She whispered, her voice raspy but entirely steady. But he is a follower. When I am gone, he will find someone else to lead him, and he will let them do whatever they want just to keep the house quiet. I had cried then, begging her not to talk like that, but she simply squeezed my hands harder, forcing me to look her directly in the eyes. I have set up a legal structure for the life insurance and the family inheritance, she told me. It is locked. Do not ever let anyone convince you to unlock it for them. Protect what you build. Claire, never let your kindness be managed by people who have none. I did not fully understand the profound weight of her words at 22. I did not know what an irrevocable trust was, nor did I grasp why she had insisted on using an independent fiduciary lawyer from Seattle instead of our local family attorney. I just nodded, crying into her shoulder, promising I would do whatever she asked. Sitting in my childhood bedroom all these years later, staring at the forged bank rejection letter, my mother's foresight felt like a physical shield wrapping around my shoulders. Sarah had known. She had looked at the fundamental cowardice in my father's heart and calculated the exact trajectory of our family's future. She had left me a weapon disguised as a legal document, and for the past decade, it had been sitting silently in a vault, waiting for the exact moment the perimeter was breached. The ghost of my mother was standing guard. The tension in the house simmered just below the boiling point until the evening of my third day on leave. Valerie had prepared an elaborate roast for dinner, setting the dining room table with the good silver and lighting 2 taper candles. It was a theatrical production designed to project an image of a loving, cohesive family unit. David sat at the head of the table, looking incredibly uncomfortable, keeping his eyes glued to his water glass. I sat down quietly, unfolding my linen napkin. I knew an ambush was coming. The tactical staging was simply too obvious. Valerie did not even wait for the food to be served. She walked into the dining room carrying a thick manila folder and dropped it squarely onto the table, right next to my empty dinner plate. The heavy thud of the paper echoed in the quiet room. I had the broker draw up the new guarantee forms, Valerie announced, taking her seat with a wide, artificial smile. We just need your signature on the bottom line. Claire, it will take 2 seconds, and then your uncle's business will be completely safe. I looked at the folder, then up at her. I already gave you my answer. Valerie. Her smile did not falter, but her eyes hardened into twin chips of black ice. Family means sharing the risk, Claire. You have been incredibly blessed in your career. It is deeply selfish to hoard your blessings when the people who raised you are struggling to survive. My hazard pay is not a blessing, I replied, my voice completely flat. It is compensation for keeping children alive at 5,000 feet in the air. Valerie leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table. She decided it was time to stop playing nice. She decided to show me exactly how much leverage she thought she possessed. You do not need all that money sitting around doing nothing, she said, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. $84,210? The dining room went dead silent. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. $84,210. That was the exact, down-to-the-penny balance of my secondary emergency savings account as of last Friday. It was an account I had never once mentioned to anyone in this house. It was an account attached to an entirely different financial institution. She didn't just guess a random, large number. She had somehow accessed a live snapshot of my private financial architecture. She was looking at my monetary vitals. Valerie sat back, looking incredibly smug, waiting for me to panic. She expected outrage. She expected me to demand how she knew that number. I did not give her the satisfaction. I did not scream at Valerie. I did not ask her how she had obtained my private banking details. Confronting a thief without fully understanding how they picked your lock is a tactical error that only gives them time to hide their tools. Instead, I slowly turned my head and looked directly at David. This was his house. This was his dining room table. I was his eldest daughter, and the woman sitting across from me had just brazenly confessed to committing financial espionage against me. This was the moment any decent father would stand up, slam his hand on the table, and demand an explanation from his wife. I watched David with the clinical detachment of a nurse monitoring a failing heart rate. I waited for the spike. I waited for the intervention. David meticulously sawed a piece of the roast beef. His hands were trembling slightly, making the silver knife scrape harshly against the fine porcelain plate. The sound was grating and pathetic. He chewed his food slowly, swallowing hard, and finally lifted his eyes. But he did not look at Valerie. He looked at me. "Just sign the paper." "Claire," he mumbled, his voice thick with cowardly exhaustion. "You have plenty in the bank. Just help your mother out so we can have some peace in this house." The words hit me with the blunt force of a physical blow. He didn't care that she had violated my privacy. He didn't care that she had somehow bypassed my security. He only cared that her resulting anger was making his evening uncomfortable. He was entirely willing to sacrifice my hard-earned security just to buy himself a few days of domestic tranquility. If you have ever realized that a parent's weakness was actually a form of betrayal, you understand exactly how cold the room gets in that moment. My mother's dying words echoed loudly in my mind. He will let them do whatever they want just to keep the house quiet. She had been absolutely right. The deepest wound did not come from the wicked stepmother's greed. It came from the quiet, downward gaze of the man who was supposed to be my protector. David had not handed her the knife, but he was actively holding my arms down so she could make the cut. Any lingering sense of familial obligation I held in my heart evaporated in that exact second. The daughter who wanted to save her father died quietly at that dining room table. What remained was only the chief flight nurse. And a flight nurse knows exactly what to do when a limb becomes infected with necrotic tissue. You amputate to save the life. I carefully picked up my linen napkin, folded it neatly into a square, and placed it beside my untouched dinner plate. I did not say a single word. Valerie's smug expression began to fracture slightly at the edges. She had anticipated rage, tears, or a desperate negotiation. My absolute silence unnerved her. People who use noise and drama to control a room never know how to handle someone who simply refuses to participate in the performance. "Are you ignoring me, Claire?" Valerie demanded, her voice rising an octave, trying to force the confrontation back onto her terms. "I am talking to you about the reality of this family's financial situation." I pushed my chair back from the table. It scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I stood up, smoothing the front of my sweater. I looked at the manila folder, then at Valerie, and finally at David, who was suddenly very interested in his water glass. I turned my back on both of them and walked out of the dining room. "Don't you walk away from me!" Valerie shouted down the hallway. "You are acting like a selfish, spoiled brat." I climbed the stairs with measured, even steps. I walked into the guest bedroom and closed the door. I turned the brass lock, feeling the heavy, satisfying click of the mechanism falling into place. The shouting downstairs became muffled, distant background noise. I did not throw myself onto the bed to cry. I did not pace the floor in a panic. I walked straight to my travel bag and pulled out my laptop. When you find the first sign of a massive systemic breach, you do not react with emotion. You react with data. I sat at the small desk by the window, the blue light of the screen illuminating the dark room. I opened an encrypted browser window and began the systematic process of pulling every single digital thread of my life. I downloaded my comprehensive credit reports from all 3 major bureaus. I requested the login IP histories for my secondary savings accounts. I initiated a deep scan of my primary email recovery settings. My fingers flew across the keyboard with the same rapid, precise muscle memory I used when administering critical care medications. Valerie thought she had won a psychological victory at dinner by revealing that number. She did not realise she had simply handed me the exact coordinates of her attack. She had shown me the symptom. Now, I was going to diagnose the disease. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the house was entirely silent, but my computer screen was flooded with terrifying answers. The credit reports confirmed what the rejection letter had suggested. Valerie had not just attempted one commercial loan application. There were 3 separate hard inquiries on my credit file over the past month. All of them originated from local lending agencies. She had been shopping my identity around town like a piece of stolen jewellery. But the most chilling discovery came when I checked the access logs for Sarah's irrevocable trust portal. I almost never logged into that specific account. It was designed to sit dormant, compounding interest, legally shielded from the world until I reached the age of 40. Because I rarely checked it, it was the perfect blind spot. There was a bright red security alert blinking in my message centre 3 days ago. There had been a formal request submitted to the bank's emergency service line to bypass the 2-factor authentication and reset the master password. I clicked open the attached case file. The bank had uploaded the documentation submitted by the caller to verify their identity. My blood ran completely cold. It was a scanned copy of a general medical proxy and power of attorney. It was a generic family document David had pressured me into signing a decade ago, back when I first started flying medevac missions, just in case I was ever severely injured in a crash. It gave my father, and by legal extension, his spouse, the right to handle my affairs if I was medically incapacitated. Valerie had faxed this ancient, unnotarized document to the bank. The call transcript attached to the file showed her exact words. She had claimed I was on a high-risk medical extraction in a remote mountain range, unreachable, and that she needed emergency access to the funds to cover an immediate family crisis on my behalf. She had weaponized the very nature of my dangerous profession to steal my identity. She used my dedication to saving lives as the perfect excuse for my absence. The bank's automated security protocols had flagged the old document and rejected the password reset, demanding a live phone verification that Valerie obviously could not provide. My mother's trust remained completely sealed. The vault had held, but Valerie had tried, and she had left a highly documented, federally time-stamped paper trail of wire fraud and identity theft. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the digital evidence glowing in the dark room. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed with a simple apology. The diagnosis was terminal. When a trauma patient arrives on the helipad with multiple severe injuries, you do not panic over the superficial cuts. You immediately identify the massive arterial bleed, you apply a tourniquet, you stop the catastrophic loss before you do absolutely anything else. Sitting in the dark at 2 a.m, bathed in the blue light of my laptop screen, I shifted entirely into clinical triage mode. Valerie was the trauma. My financial identity was the bleeding artery. I picked up my phone and dialed the 24-hour emergency fraud hotline for my secondary national bank. I did not care that I was operating on less than 4 hours of sleep. My mind was sharper than a surgical blade. A representative answered after 3 rings. I spoke in a quiet, measured tone, verifying my identity using a highly specific alphanumeric passcode I had set up 7 years ago. It was a code I had never written down on a physical piece of paper, a code that Valerie could never possibly guess. I instructed the fraud department to place a hard, absolute freeze on my social security number across all 3 major credit bureaus. I then requested a complete lockdown of all my secondary savings accounts. No wire transfers, no password resets, no authorised users could be added without my physical presence in a branch, and 2 forms of federal identification. The representative on the phone sounded slightly alarmed by the severity of my requests, asking if I had lost my wallet or been the victim of a cyber attack. I told him the threat was domestic. I spent the next 45 minutes systematically revoking every single generic medical proxy or general power of attorney that had ever been drafted with David's name on it. I contacted the hospital administration where I worked, updating my emergency contacts to remove my father entirely. I replaced him with a trusted senior flight surgeon who understood my wishes perfectly. I watched the confirmation emails roll into my encrypted inbox one by one. Each digital notification was another stitch closing the wound. Each successful freeze was a heavy iron door slamming shut, locking Valerie out in the cold. She had tried to use my absence to steal my future. She assumed my chaotic schedule made me an easy, distracted target. But my schedule had taught me how to operate with lethal precision under immense pressure. By the time the sun began to rise over the quiet Portland suburbs, my financial perimeter was completely sealed. No one could take a single dollar. The bleeding was officially stopped. Securing the accounts was only the initial phase of the operation. I still needed to understand exactly how Valerie had obtained my physical documentation. The generic medical proxy she had faxed to the bank was an old, hard copy document. I kept locked inside a small fireproof safe in the bottom drawer of my bedroom desk. I rarely brought the key to that safe out of the house. I usually kept it hidden inside a hollowed-out medical textbook on my bookshelf. I opened a separate app on my phone 2 years ago, when Lily was going through a phase of sleepwalking. I had quietly installed a tiny, motion-activated security camera on the top shelf of the guest room. I had told David it was just a baby monitor to make sure Lily didn't wander toward the steep stairs when I was visiting. I had simply never uninstalled it. I scrolled back through the cloud storage, jumping to the exact date the commercial loan rejection letter had been generated. The grainy, black and white night vision footage loaded onto my screen. The timestamp read 1 in the afternoon. I was on a 48-hour rotation that day. The bedroom door slowly clicked open. Valerie walked into the frame. She wasn't cleaning. She wasn't looking for laundry. She moved with deliberate, practiced stealth. I watched her walk straight to the bookshelf, pull down my medical textbook, and retrieve the small silver key. She knew exactly where it was. David must have mentioned my hiding spot to her in passing, completely oblivious to her true intentions. The camera angle perfectly captured her unlocking the bottom drawer. She pulled out the heavy fireproof box, inserted the key, and lifted the lid. She spent 8 full minutes carefully photographing my social security card, my birth certificate, and the old medical proxy with her smartphone. I watched her meticulously place everything back exactly as she had found it. She even smoothed out the carpet fibres where her knees had rested. There is a very specific type of disgust that washes over you when you watch someone violate your private sanctuary. It is a cold, creeping sensation that settles deep in your bones. She had treated my life like a bargain bin at a thrift store, sifting through my most sensitive legal protections to find something she could pawn for her brother's failing business. I exported the video file directly to a secure, encrypted folder on my hard drive. I made 3 separate backups. I did not feel anger. Anger is a messy, unpredictable emotion. I felt a profound sense of absolute clarity. She had given me the exact ammunition I needed. The evidence was now absolute. I walked downstairs at 7 in the morning. The smell of artificial vanilla was already thick in the air. Valerie was standing by the espresso machine, looking perfectly rested and immaculately dressed. David had already left for the hardware store, retreating from the house before any real conversation could happen. It was just the 2 of us. I poured myself a simple glass of cold water and leaned against the granite counter. Valerie decided to abandon the subtle manipulation. The polite, concerned stepmother act had failed, so she pivoted directly to intimidation. "I spoke with a financial advisor yesterday," Valerie said, her voice dripping with artificial authority. "He advised me that as your father's wife, I have a legal right to ensure the family's assets are not being recklessly hoarded, especially considering the dangerous nature of your job. Claire, you are constantly in the air. You could suffer a severe brain injury tomorrow." I took a slow sip of my water. I let the silence stretch out, forcing her to fill the uncomfortable void. "If you refuse to sign the guarantee for your uncle," she continued, her eyes narrowing, "I will have no choice but to petition a judge to freeze your assets. We will cite your high-stress environment and claim you are experiencing severe psychological trauma from your flight duties. We will say you are no longer mentally fit to manage your own finances. The courts will appoint David as your conservator, and I will manage the accounts." It was a breathtakingly cruel threat. She was threatening to weaponize my career, to label me mentally unstable simply because I saved lives for a living, all to steal my money. She thought the threat of a public, embarrassing legal battle would terrify me into submission. If you are listening to this and your blood is boiling at this audacity, type "ready to see how I excise this tumour." She stood there, arms crossed over her chest, waiting for me to break. She expected me to beg her not to ruin my career. She expected me to finally surrender my boundaries to protect my professional reputation. I looked at her with the exact same expression I use when a psychiatric patient screams at me in the emergency room. It was a look of complete, detached observation. "You should absolutely hire that lawyer, Valerie," I said softly, setting my glass down on the counter. "I think that is a wonderful idea." Her confident posture faltered for a fraction of a second. She did not know how to process my calm agreement. I let her keep talking. I left the house an hour later. I did not tell Valerie where I was going, and she did not ask. She was too busy basking in the false glory of her own ultimatum, convinced she had finally backed me into a corner. I drove straight into the heart of downtown Portland. I parked my car in an underground garage and took the elevator up to the 32nd floor of a sleek, glass-walled office building. This was not the kind of cheap, strip mall legal clinic Valerie would use to draft her empty threats. This was a premier corporate firm. I sat in a heavy leather chair across from Patricia, my private fiduciary attorney. Patricia was in her early 60s, possessing a brilliant, razor-sharp mind and an absolute intolerance for nonsense. I placed the manila envelope containing the credit rejection letter, the bank access logs, and the screenshots from the hidden camera directly onto her polished mahogany desk. Patricia put on her reading glasses and reviewed the documents in complete silence. Her expression remained completely neutral, but I saw the slight tightening of her jaw. "Your stepmother is a remarkably arrogant amateur," Patricia said, taking off her glasses. "She actually faxed a 10-year-old unnotarized medical proxy to a federal institution to attempt a password override. That is textbook wire fraud." "She threatened to petition for a conservatorship this morning," I told her quietly. "She claims she will use my hazard pay and flight trauma to declare me mentally unfit." Patricia let out a short, dry laugh. "Let her try. It is time to deploy the safety net your mother built. When Sarah died, she did not simply leave me a pile of cash. She left me an incredibly sophisticated legal structure. 5 years ago, working closely with Patricia, I had finalised a springing power of attorney. It was a specialised legal document that immediately and permanently revoked David's old medical proxy the moment anyone attempted to use it without my direct verbal authorisation to my primary physician. Furthermore, the trust Sarah established was locked behind a titanium legal wall. Valerie was trying to pick a lock on a door that didn't even have a keyhole. "I want the cease and desist letters drafted today," I instructed Patricia, my voice perfectly steady. I want the fraud packets prepared for the federal authorities, but do not file them yet. I want the paperwork in my hands first. Patricia nodded, her pen gliding across her legal pad. She understood the assignment perfectly. The real trap was set. If you have never dealt with high-level estate planning, you might believe the threats Valerie made in my kitchen. You might think that a determined stepmother with a cheap lawyer and a copy of your social security card could actually freeze your life. But the legal system, when utilised correctly, is a fortress of absolute unfeeling process. An irrevocable trust is not a simple savings account. It is a completely separate, independent legal entity. When my mother placed her assets into that trust, those assets ceased to belong to her, and they certainly did not belong to my father. They belonged to the trust itself. I was merely the designated beneficiary, and Patricia's firm was the institutional trustee. Valerie's attempt to use a general medical proxy to access an irrevocable trust was like bringing a plastic butter knife to a tank battle. The banking institution does not care about your tears, your family drama, or your desperate need to save a failing commercial business. They care about fiduciary duty and federal compliance. To break an irrevocable trust, Valerie would need to prove in a federal court that the trust was established under fraudulent circumstances, which was impossible since Sarah had been dead for over a decade. To establish a conservatorship over me, she would need sworn affidavits from multiple licensed psychiatrists declaring me incompetent. My hospital employed a dozen psychiatrists who would gladly testify to my absolute, unwavering mental acuity. Valerie was operating on television logic. She thought whoever yelled the loudest and made the most dramatic threats would automatically win the argument. I operated on process logic. I did not need to yell. I had hundreds of pages of federally notarized documentation stamped with the seal of the state, backed by a law firm that billed $800 an hour. Sitting in Patricia's office, watching her paralegals compile the thick, heavy stacks of legal warnings, I felt a profound sense of peace. The anxiety that had plagued me for years, the fear that my family would eventually bleed me completely dry, evaporated. I did not have to argue with Valerie's manipulation. I just had to let the crushing weight of the legal system fall directly onto her shoulders. I signed the final authorizations with a smooth black fountain pen. The ink dried quickly on the heavy parchment paper. The fortress was fully armed. By the time I left Patricia's office, the late afternoon sky over Portland had turned a bruised, heavy shade of grey. The classic Pacific Northwest rain was just beginning to fall, slicking the streets and blurring the headlights of passing cars. I sat in the driver's seat of my vehicle for a long time before turning the ignition key. Resting on the passenger seat beside me was a thick crimson-coloured legal folder. It was an incredibly simple object, just pressed cardboard and metal clasps, but it carried the weight of absolute, undeniable truth. Inside that folder was the architectural blueprint of Valerie's deceit. There were printed, high-resolution screenshots from the hidden camera showing her violating my personal safe. There were detailed IP logs and stamped access denial reports from the trust portal. There was the formal, typed rejection letter for the $250,000 commercial loan she had tried to secure using my stolen identity. And finally, resting at the very back, were the freshly notarized cease and desist orders, ready to be deployed. I traced the edge of the folder with my index finger. In my line of work, we rely heavily on medical charts. A chart strips away all the emotion, the panic, and the subjective storytelling of the patient. A chart only tells you the objective reality of the failing organs. This red folder was Valerie's chart. It was a precise, documented diagnosis of her greed. I did not feel anxious about the impending confrontation. I felt the exact, crystalline focus that takes over when the helicopter doors slide open at an accident scene. You stop being a person with feelings, and you become an instrument of procedure. I was no longer a daughter returning to her childhood home. I was a professional arriving to perform an emergency amputation. Have you ever used legal documents and cold, hard facts to instantly shut down a toxic person's lies? If this resonates with you, do not look away because the real storm is about to begin. I drove back to the suburban house in complete silence, leaving the radio off. I needed to preserve the quiet architecture of my thoughts. I needed to rehearse the sequence of my surgical strikes. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always did. Warm yellow light spilled from the living room windows. The manicured lawn was perfectly green. It was the ultimate facade of a happy, functional family. I turned off the engine and picked up the red folder. It felt heavy and substantial in my hands. I walked up the concrete steps, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. The scent of artificial vanilla hit me immediately. I was ready to operate. I carried the truth inside. I walked straight into the kitchen. Valerie was standing by the stove, stirring a pot of soup. David was sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling mindlessly through his phone. They both looked up when I entered. Valerie's eyes immediately darted to the heavy red folder in my hands, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing her perfectly powdered face. She quickly recovered, pasting on her usual mask of condescending authority. I hope you spent the afternoon thinking about your responsibilities. Claire? Valerie said smoothly. Have you decided to do the right thing and sign the guarantee for your uncle? I did not answer her. Instead, I walked into the formal dining room and turned on the overhead chandelier. The mahogany table was empty, polished to a high shine. I need both of you to sit down at this table, I said. My voice was completely flat. It was not a request. David frowned, looking nervously toward the kitchen. Claire, your mother is cooking. Let's not start another argument right now. Sit down, David, I repeated, looking directly into his eyes. The absolute lack of emotion in my tone must have finally registered with him. He slowly put his phone in his pocket and walked into the dining room, pulling out a chair. Valerie followed a moment later, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her jaw set in a tight, defensive line. She sat directly across from me. David sat at the head of the table. I placed the red folder squarely in the centre of the wood. I did not open it yet. I simply rested my hands on top of the crimson cover. The silence in the room was suffocating. I let it stretch for 10 full seconds, establishing absolute control over the pacing of the conversation. I turned my head and looked at David. Do you know why the medical field pays me a high-hazard premium, David? I asked softly. He blinked, entirely caught off guard by the question. Because you fly in helicopters. Because it is dangerous work. No, I replied smoothly. They pay me hazard pay because I have to make life or death decisions while operating in highly toxic, unstable environments. I am trained to look at a catastrophic failure and remain completely unaffected by the chaos. I shifted my gaze from David to Valerie. The slight smirk had vanished from her lips. For the past 3 days, I have been assessing a catastrophic failure inside this house. I told her, and tonight I'm delivering the final diagnosis. I opened the red cover. The room fell completely silent. Valerie immediately tried to seize control of the narrative. I do not know what kind of theatrical game you are playing, Claire, but I will not sit here and be disrespected in my own home. She started to push her chair back. You will sit exactly where you are, I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the sharp, unyielding edge of a command. I pulled the first piece of paper from the folder and slid it across the polished mahogany. It was the formal rejection letter from the commercial bank, citing the $250,000 loan denial. 10 days ago, I began, reading the data like a medical chart. You submitted a fraudulent commercial mortgage guarantee using my name, my date of birth, and my social security number. The bank denied it due to lack of secondary physical verification. Valerie stared at the paper, her face draining of colour. That is a misunderstanding. I was simply exploring financial options for the family. I did not let her finish. I pulled out the second stack of papers. 3 days ago, I continued smoothly, sliding the bank logs across the table. You faxed a 10-year-old invalid medical proxy to a federal institution. You attempted to bypass the two-factor authentication on a locked, irrevocable trust by claiming I was incapacitated in a remote flight zone. David gasped quietly, his eyes darting between the papers and his wife. Valerie, what is she talking about? She is lying, Valerie snapped, her voice trembling with rising panic. She is fabricating this to avoid helping her family. I reached into the back of the folder and pulled out the high-resolution photographs exported from the hidden camera. I laid them out in a neat, chronological row right in front of her. 1 in the afternoon, 4 days ago. I stated clinically, you entered the guest room. You removed the silver key from the hollow medical textbook. You opened the fireproof safe. You photographed my birth certificate and my social security card. Valerie stared at the grainy images of herself kneeling on the carpet. Her mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The arrogant, condescending mask completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but the terrified expression of a thief caught under blinding stadium lights. There is no argument against photographic evidence. There is no emotional manipulation that can erase a federal timestamp. I had surgically removed every single lie she could possibly tell. I looked at her pale, trembling hands resting on the table. Her lies were bleeding out. With Valerie rendered entirely speechless by the mountain of physical evidence, I turned my attention back to the head of the table. David was staring at the photographs of his wife picking the lock of my private safe. His face was a picture of pure, devastated shock. But beneath the shock, I could see the familiar, cowardly gears turning in his head. I could see him desperately trying to find a way to minimize the damage, to smooth over the jagged edges of reality so he wouldn't have to confront the monster he had married. Claire, David stammered, his voice weak and shaking. We can fix this. She made a terrible mistake, but we can talk about it. Family does not destroy family over a mistake. No real harm was done. No real harm was done. Those 5 words were the ultimate testament to his profound weakness. This was not a mistake. David, I said, my voice steady, though a cold, hard truth was solidifying in my chest. A mistake is forgetting to pay a utility bill. Methodically forging federal loan documents and attempting to hack a trust fund is a calculated criminal operation. I leaned forward slightly, forcing him to hold my gaze. This was the moment I had to address the deepest wound. You want to know the absolute worst part of all this? I asked quietly. It isn't her greed. I always knew exactly what she was. The worst part is you. David flinched as if I had physically struck him. I didn't know she was doing this, Claire. I swear to you, I didn't know. You knew enough, I countered, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. You knew she was interrogating me about my savings. You knew she brought a commercial loan packet to dinner. You sat right there, cutting your roast beef, while she openly tried to extort me using Lily's education as a weapon. You watched your wife try to bleed your daughter dry, and you chose to stare at your plate. He opened his mouth, tears pooling in his eyes, but I raised my hand to stop him. You are the gatekeeper of this family, I told him, delivering the final, fatal diagnosis. And you traded my safety, my future, and my financial security just to keep your living room quiet. You are not a victim here, David. You are a silent accomplice. The tears finally spilled over his cheeks, dropping silently onto his collar. The illusion of the loving father was completely gone. He had absolutely no answer. The dining room felt like a vacuum, completely devoid of oxygen. The devastating reality of the situation had finally settled over the table like a heavy lead blanket. Valerie, realizing that David was not going to ride to her rescue, desperately tried to pull together the shredded remnants of her dignity. She sat up straighter, crossing her arms defensively. "So, what are you going to do, Claire?" She spat, her voice laced with venom. "Are you going to call the police? Are you going to throw your own family in jail over a few pieces of paper? You are just as cold and heartless as I always thought you were." I did not rise to the bait. I simply reached into the red folder one last time. "I am not going to call the police," I said smoothly, sliding the thick, legally bound stack of documents toward her. "Because criminal court takes years, and I do not have the time or the interest to drag this out." Valerie looked down at the documents. The bold, black letterhead of Patricia's elite corporate law firm was printed across the top of the first page. "This is a formal cease and desist order, filed and stamped by a federal judge," I explained, my tone perfectly conversational. "It legally prohibits you from using, discussing, or referencing my name, my social security number, or any of my financial entities. Furthermore, the old medical proxy has been legally shredded. The irrevocable trust has been updated with a zero-tolerance fraud alert." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. "If you ever attempt to contact my banks, my employer, or my legal representatives again," I continued calmly. "This paperwork automatically triggers a civil lawsuit for punitive damages, followed immediately by a federal wire fraud indictment. Patricia's firm will execute the filings before you can even finish dialing the phone." Valerie stared at the legal threat, her eyes wide. She realized, in that singular moment, that she was completely outmatched. She had brought emotional manipulation to a legal war, and she had been utterly annihilated. "You are entirely cut off," I pronounced, finalizing the amputation. "There will be no loans. There will be no bailouts. The bank is permanently closed." I stood up from the table, leaving the papers scattered across the wood. I had delivered the chart. I had stopped the bleeding. My work here was done. The tumour was finally removed. I was halfway to the staircase when Valerie suddenly let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. It was a grating, unnatural sound that echoed loudly against the high ceilings. "Do you really think a fancy letterhead changes anything?" Valerie mocked, standing up from the table with a sudden, chaotic burst of energy. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes held a manic gleam. She reached into the pocket of her expensive cardigan and pulled out a folded, aggressively stamped document of her own. She threw it onto the table next to my red folder. "I visited a lawyer yesterday too. Claire," she announced triumphantly. "A very aggressive family law attorney. That is an emergency petition for temporary guardianship. I am filing it with the county clerk first thing tomorrow morning." I paused at the base of the stairs, turning back to look at her. I did not blink. "My lawyer reviewed your flight logs," Valerie continued, her voice rising in a desperate crescendo. "We are arguing that your extreme hazard environment has triggered severe PTSD and cognitive decline. The judge will freeze your trust fund pending a full, independent psychological evaluation. You cannot touch a single dime until the court clears you, which could take a year." It was her final, desperate counterattack. She believed she had found a back door, a way to use the legal system's slow bureaucracy to strangle my finances and force me into a settlement. I looked at the cheap, poorly formatted petition resting on the mahogany table. Then I looked back at her. "You clearly did not read the second page of my packet, Valerie," I said softly. Valerie frowned, her manic confidence slipping. She snatched up Patricia's documents and flipped to the second page. "That is a preemptive sworn affidavit from the chief of psychiatry at my hospital," I explained, watching the colour drain from her face for the second time that night. "It was notarized yesterday. It certifies my absolute, unimpeachable mental competence. It is already on file with the county clerk." Her cheap lawyer's petition was completely neutralised before she even filed it. Any judge would look at her unverified claim against the sworn testimony of a leading medical chief and immediately throw her petition into the shredder, likely sanctioning her attorney for frivolous filing in the process. I had anticipated her final move before she even knew how to play the game. "File your petition, Valerie," I said, my voice a quiet whisper. "See exactly how fast Patricia bankrupts you with legal fees." She stared at the affidavit, the paper trembling violently in her hands. The hysterical laughter died completely in her throat. She had absolutely nothing left. The next morning arrived with the heavy grey drizzle that defines the Pacific Northwest. I woke up at 6 o'clock, guided by my internal medical clock, and began packing my travel duffel. I folded my clothes with the exact same methodical precision I used when restocking the trauma supply bags on the helicopter. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt incredibly light, as if a massive, invisible weight had finally been surgically removed from my spine. I carried my bag downstairs. The house felt entirely different today. The artificial vanilla scent was completely gone, replaced by the stale, heavy odour of unresolved consequence. Valerie was nowhere to be seen. She was likely hiding in the master bedroom, too humiliated and legally terrified to show her face. David was standing by the front door. He looked 10 years older than he had the night before. His shoulders were slumped, and the skin around his eyes was red and swollen. He had clearly not slept. He watched me walk down the stairs, his hands twisting nervously in his pockets. "Claire," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "Please do not leave like this. We can sit down and talk. We can go to family counselling. I will make her apologise to you properly." I stopped at the bottom of the staircase and looked at him. I did not feel the familiar, desperate urge to fix his sadness. "There is nothing left to talk about. David," I said calmly, "you cannot counsel away a federal felony, and I do not need her forced apology. I already have my security." Tears began to spill over his lower eyelids, tracking down his weathered cheeks. "I am your father," he pleaded, reaching a hand out toward my arm. "I love you. You have to find a way to forgive us." I stepped back, ensuring his hand grasped nothing but empty air. I looked at the man who had traded my safety for his comfort, and I offered him the absolute truth. "I might forgive you someday. David," I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Holding on to resentment is terrible for the heart, but you need to understand something very clearly." He wiped his eyes, looking at me with a desperate, pathetic flicker of hope. "Forgiveness does not mean restoring access," I said firmly. "I can forgive you from a distance, but you will never have a key to my life again." The flicker of hope in his eyes died instantly, replaced by the crushing realization of his own permanent loss. I walked past him, opened the heavy front door, and stepped out into the cold morning rain. I placed my duffel bag into the trunk of my car and climbed into the driver's seat. I started the ignition, the engine purring smoothly. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the suburban driveway, leaving them behind to face the suffocating mountain of debt they had built together. I never looked back. 3 months passed. The transition back to my grueling flight schedule was seamless. The chaos of the trauma centre felt incredibly peaceful compared to the psychological warfare of my father's house. I sat in Patricia's sleek downtown office, a steaming cup of green tea resting on the polished mahogany desk between us. We were finalising the last piece of my architectural plan. I had neutralised Valerie. I had severed the necrotic tie with David. But there was still one innocent casualty left on the battlefield, and I refused to leave her behind. "The paperwork is fully executed. Claire?" Patricia said, sliding a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the desk. "The Sarah Educational Trust is officially active." I opened the portfolio and reviewed the documents. I had taken $25,000 of my own hazard pay and placed it into a heavily restricted, third-party managed educational fund for Lily. "Walk me through the disbursement protocols one more time," I requested, wanting to hear the absolute finality of it. Patricia adjusted her glasses, her tone shifting into pure legal precision. "The trust is managed exclusively by a national banking institution. Valerie and David have absolutely zero administrative rights. If Lily needs tuition for her private school, the bank wires the exact amount directly to the school's billing department. If she needs textbooks or a laptop, the vendors are paid directly by the trust." I nodded slowly, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. "Valerie cannot touch a single cent of this money," Patricia continued, offering a rare, knowing smile. "She cannot claim reimbursement. She cannot use the funds to leverage her own household expenses. When Lily turns 18, the remaining balance converts to a university scholarship fund, governed by the exact same strict parameters. Valerie had tried to use Lily as a human shield. She had tried to extort me by threatening a 12-year-old girl's education. My response was not to abandon my sister, but to completely remove the hostage takers from the equation. I had secured Lily's future in a fortress of federal compliance. I asked Patricia to mail a formal notification to David's house, addressed solely to Valerie. I wanted her to open that letter. I wanted her to read the ironclad terms of the trust. I wanted her to realise that I had easily provided the exact thing she claimed to want, but in a way that offered her absolutely no financial benefit. It was the ultimate, cold-blooded act of grace. I signed the final authorization page and handed the expensive fountain pen back to Patricia. The legal wall was now complete. I had protected the only innocent person left in that family, and I had done it without compromising a single millimetre of my own boundaries. The child was finally safe. The greatest reward of surviving a lifetime of emotional extortion is the sudden, breathtaking arrival of absolute peace. A month after finalising the trust, I purchased a small, beautiful wooden cabin nestled deep in the Cascade Mountains. I bought it completely in cash, utilising a portion of the investment portfolio I had spent 15 years quietly building. The deed was registered to an anonymous limited liability company managed by Patricia's firm. Valerie and David would never even know what state I lived in. I woke up on a crisp Tuesday morning. The air inside the cabin was cold, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine needles and damp earth. I walked into my small, rustic kitchen. I did not have $30,000 worth of marble countertops here. I had simple butcher block wood and a reliable cast iron stove. I ground fresh coffee beans and carefully poured hot water over the dark grounds, watching the steam rise into the morning sunlight filtering through the window. There was no sound of helicopter rotors beating against the wind. There were no blaring trauma alarms or frantic radio calls from emergency dispatch, and more importantly, there was no sound of a manipulative stepmother demanding my credit score, or a cowardly father shuffling his feet in the hallway. For the first time in my 38 years of life, the silence belonged entirely to me. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic mug and stepped out onto the back deck. The view overlooked a dense, emerald green valley, untouched by the chaotic noise of the city. This was what the hazard pay had actually bought. It had not been accumulated to bail out a failing uncle. It had not been saved to patch the leaking roof of a dysfunctional family dynamic. Every grueling shift, every sleepless night, every drop of blood I had washed off my uniform had been a brick laid down to build this exact sanctuary. My mother, Sarah, had known this day would eventually come. She had given me the legal tools to defend my perimeter, but I had to find the courage to actually close the gates. I took a deep breath of the freezing mountain air. I felt the steady, reliable rhythm of my own heart beating in my chest. I was entirely alone, and I had never felt more secure. The girl who used to desperately send $50 to buy her father's affection was gone. The woman standing on the deck was unbreakable. The silence was incredibly beautiful. I sat down in the heavy wooden rocking chair on my porch, watching the morning mist slowly burn off the distant tree line. People who have never been exploited by their own relatives often possess a very romanticized view of family. They believe that blood is an unconditional currency, capable of purchasing endless forgiveness and infinite financial bailouts. They do not understand the profound, devastating toll of being the designated saviour. David and Valerie had demanded that I set myself on fire simply to keep their living room warm. They believed my independence was a resource they had an absolute right to mine. Sometimes, the most vital lesson you will ever learn is that protecting yourself is not an act of cruelty. Setting a boundary is not an act of aggression. A boundary is simply a highly visible fence that dictates where someone else's entitlement ends and your basic human dignity begins. I did not destroy Valerie's life. I simply refused to let her use my identity to commit fraud. I did not ruin David's marriage. I simply held up a mirror and forced him to look at the cowardice he had married. I left them in the exact house they had built together to survive the exact financial storms they had created themselves. My mother's note, written so many years ago from a hospital bed, finally made absolute perfect sense. Never let your kindness be managed by people who have none. I had executed her final wish. I had deployed the legal weapons she had so carefully prepared, and I had successfully excised the toxic tumour from my life. I had saved my young sister's future, and I had preserved my own. I took a final sip of my coffee. The cup was warm, the air was crisp, and the future stretching out in front of me was entirely, unyieldingly my own. If you believe that my peace is a hard-won victory, and if you think walking away from toxic family members is a sign of immense strength, please share this story with someone who desperately needs the courage to finally say the word no. My life is truly mine,